and welcome to the Confederation Club of Waterloo's 2021 Winter Webinar Series. Our goal was to bring Canadian digital politics to life. My name is Barb Shackleton, and I'm the Confederation Club Director of Marketing and your host for today's webinar, with the Honourable Michael Chong, Member of Parliament for Wellington, Halton Hills, and the Foreign Affairs Shadow Minister. Michael will be speaking on a timely topic of Canada in a turbulent and unsettled world. Before we dive in, just a few items of interest to mention. We are recording this webinar, so you'll be able to share and listen to it on our website at confederationclub.ca. And we also plan to poll the audience before you exit this evening, so we encourage you to participate, and we can assure you that your responses are completely anonymous, and we do appreciate your input. If you wish to submit a question, pop it into the chat question box, and Stephen Cage, our speakers committee chair, will be our Q&A moderator this evening, and he will attempt to get to as many questions as time allows. So please ensure your questions are appropriate. Let's dive in. For those of you who may or may not know about Confederation Club, just a little background about our organization. The Confederation Club of Waterloo was founded in 1976 with Joe Clark as our first speaker about a month before he became party leader. Our speakers have included past Conservative and Progressive Conservative Prime Ministers, Brian Mulroney, Kim Campbell, and Stephen Harper. Our impressive speakers list from the past 45 years are available on our website at confederationclub.ca. We look forward to continuing the tradition of hosting Conservative Prime Ministers in the near future. I want to provide a little bit of context for the Waterloo region. And we definitely punch above our weight. As Canada's high-tech capital, we are home to Google's Canadian engineering headquarters and home to world-class companies that include Shopify, Applyboard, IntelliJoint Surgical, Vidyard, and my own amazing employer, Igloo Software, the world's top intranet. We boast a spectacular array of advanced manufacturing that include Toyota, Christie Digital, ATS Automation, and Turbulent Systems. And our wonderful Mennonite community entrenches a strong work ethic and community spirit second to none. And our world famous St. Jacob's Market is a great destination that you will hopefully be able to visit in the coming months. Without further ado, I will now ask Jerry Zhang, President of Confederation Club, and I should mention the 2019 Conservative candidate for the Waterloo riding, to formally introduce our guest speaker. Jerry, take it away.
Thank you, Barb. Welcome, Michael, to Confederation Club. Michael, you're not a stranger to this club. If I remember correctly, this is the fourth time you be the being the honorable speaker to our club. But of course, online in this virtual format, it's the first time. We're all exploring the possibilities here. So Michael, Michael was first elected to Parliament in 2004, represents the riding of Wellington, Halton Hills, and currently serves as the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs for the official opposition. In 2006, Michael served in the federal cabinet as a president of the Queen's Privy Council. As a Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Minister for Sport. Michael has been chairs for several House of Commons standing committees, including Industry, Science and Technology, Canadian Heritage, and Official Languages. So in 2015, I should mention Michael's Reform Act passed Parliament and became a law. So prior to Michael's election, Michael acted as the CIO for the NHLPA and as a senior technology consultant to the GTAA. Michael also co-founded the Dominion Institute, now known as the Historica Canada. So Michael, on behalf of Confederation Club, welcome to our webinar, and please take it away. Sorry, Michael, you're muted.
See that. Thank you, Jerry. Can you hear me loud and clear? Good. Well, thank you to the members of the Confederation Club. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's great to see you on the Zoom chat tonight. I look forward to our discussion, and I'm delighted that I've been able to come here tonight to talk to you about Canada's place in a turbulent and unsettled world. So let me begin by talking about the Liberal government's record on Canadian foreign policy in that unsettled and turbulent world. I think the government has had some foreign policy accomplishments. It continued with Operation Reassurance in Eastern Europe and Operation Unifier in Ukraine, both NATO military missions that we support. In trade, the new USMCA, the replacement for NAFTA, was concluded. But I might say it was a mostly defensive outcome that will see a drop of about 0.4% in real gross domestic product relative to NAFTA, an analysis that was conducted by the C.D. Howe Institute. A trade agreement with the European Union was concluded, but it also must be said it was largely negotiated under the previous government. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, also largely negotiated under the previous Conservative government, was also concluded. But it must be said it was almost upended by the Prime Minister, who failed to show up at a meeting for 10 heads of government at the APEC summit in Vietnam in November of 2017. And more damningly, whatever hope Canada had in starting trade talks with India was lost in the embarrassing antics of the Prime Minister during his 8-day trip to the world's 5th largest economy. And so too it was with trade talks with China when he opened with his progressive proposal on the environment, labor, and gender rights, all non-starters for China. That free trade deal was over before it had even begun. In general, I believe the government's foreign policy has been a disappointment. The government's change in ministers recently does nothing to change that. We are now on the 4th Canadian foreign minister in just over 5 years and 2 months. An astonishing revolving door of foreign ministers in a very unsettled and turbulent world that requires stability. I want to get into a bit of detail about why I believe the foreign government, the Canadian government, has been a disappointment in foreign policy. You know, this government came to office with a big commitment in 2015 to resurrect Canadian peacekeeping. It sent hundreds of peacekeepers and hundreds of millions of dollars to Mali. But as in many other cases with this government, these efforts were made for only a short amount of time, barely a year. The government then lost interest in helping Mali, as well as the political commitment to do so. And just 1 year after the mission ended, which ended in August of 2019, just 1 year after that mission ended last August, there was a coup in Mali, a coup d'etat, with the government replaced by a military junta. And very little has been heard or said from the Liberal government. The 2 previous foreign ministers ago, under Minister Chrystia Freeland, she mentioned the rise of populism and distrust of the global economy as one of the 2 big challenges in foreign policy. And she pointed to the Liberal government's economic plan as a solution to that rise in populism. So the government's domestic economic plan was a pretty important part of their foreign policy. And after 5 years in power, we can judge. Now, to be sure, we are in a pandemic and economies around the world have been negatively impacted by this pandemic. But the Canadian economy was in trouble before the pandemic hit. We had record high levels of household debt. We had sluggish economic growth and negative to flat growth on a per capita GDP basis. And in this pandemic, the OECD and the IMF have predicted that we will have a deeper recession and a slower recovery than our economic peers. An economy with the highest unemployment, second to highest unemployment in the G7, and a middle class that is further behind today than it was in 2015. The harsh reality is that under the current government, Canada has become less prosperous, less united, and less respected on the world stage relative to our peers. You know, when the government came to office in 2015, it came back to power and visited the Department of Foreign Affairs. And as I've had one foreign policy expert tell me, the Prime Minister was welcomed in a mosh pit. And at that time, he told the world that Canada is back. But the facts say otherwise. Canada lost the vote for the UN Security Council seat last June. Now, we lost it 10 years ago as well, but last June, we lost the vote with 108 votes, 6 fewer votes than we received a decade ago. That's 6 fewer countries today that see Canada as a leader on the world stage. That is a quantitative indictment of the current government's foreign policy. You know, the current government came to office saying that it was going to make Canada a global leader in helping the poorest around the world. The opposite has happened. One of the official measures of foreign aid is called official development assistance. It's measured as a percentage of gross national income. Under the previous Conservative government, official development assistance averaged 0.3% of GDP for the entire 10 years that government was in office. Under the current government, for the last 5 years that they've been in office, it has averaged 0.27%, a 10% decline. In fact, Bob Rae called out the government on its failure in foreign aid in a damning indictment he wrote in a report for the government, which is available publicly on the Government of Canada's website. About Canada's official development assistance target number, he said, quote, "Canada has never come close to that number. And if our rate this year looks slightly better than last year's, it's only because the gross national income number is stagnant, if not declining. Despite this record, Canadians think of their country as generous and deeply engaged on the international front," end quote. On climate change, the current government has been a disappointment. You know, it came to office promising to do better, but the facts say otherwise. In 2016, the first full year the current government was in office, emissions were 708 megatons. In 2018, the last year for which we have data, emissions jumped to 729 megatons, a 21 megaton jump in emissions. Canada's emissions are increasing. Yet the government said in the speech from the throne just 5 months ago, that it will not only meet the Paris target in 9 years, it will exceed them. And yet again, that is another example of a yawning gap between rhetoric and reality. The Liberal government's foreign policy has been incoherent and inconsistent. For example, China is not upholding its responsibility to the rules-based international system. It is ignoring its condition of entry into the WTO. It is manipulating its currency. It interferes through state-owned enterprises. It infringes on intellectual property, and it is engaged in cyber warfare against Canadian companies like Nortel Networks, like the Canadian government. It violates international human rights treaties in its treatment. It's violating international law and treaty in its treatments of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spaver, the Uyghurs, and the people of Hong Kong. In short, it is threatening not only our interests, but our values. And so in that context, it's really important that the federal government, the government of a G7 country that is 1/7 the size of China, speak with a consistent, coherent voice. Unfortunately, that is not happening. The government has had so many flip-flops on its China policy, it's hard to know where to begin. For example, last summer in July, the Foreign Affairs Minister told the House of Commons that he was looking at sanctions on Chinese officials for their actions. A day later, a government official told Reuters that that was off the table. Last September, for example, when the Foreign Affairs Minister was telling the Globe that trade talks with China were off the table, the very same day, Canada's ambassador to China was in a meeting with the Chinese ambassador and with a number of other stakeholders in a discussion and saying that we should expand trade and do more in China. The government was supposed to come forward with a framework on China to better protect our interests and our values. They've been promising that framework for a year last year. It was supposed to be delivered by Christmas. Then we find out in November that they were no longer going to deliver that new framework, that it had been brought to cabinet last September and nixed. And so instead of a new framework, we have an evolving position that will evolve as China's actions toward us change. Just several examples of many, many that show the incoherence and inconsistency in the government's China policy. But I think perhaps the biggest problem in this government's foreign policy is where the government started. And I'm not optimistic that the government can address this fundamental problem. And here's why. Foreign policy starts with who we are. It's about a projection abroad about what we are all about. And the problem is that our Prime Minister believes that Canada has no core identity, that we are just a collection of different groups, that we are the first post-national state. I could not disagree more. Canada is not simply a collection of different groups with no common identity or common purpose. We as Canadians are some 37 million citizens who live on the north half of a vast continent, who share together a common identity, common purpose, shared citizenship, rooted in our two official languages, our shared history, our collective institutions, and our future together. That's who we are as Canadians. The problem with the Liberals' foreign policy is if you don't know who you are, then your foreign policy will reflect this. Let me finish by saying this. Foreign affairs matter. I know a lot of people say that foreign affairs is not the basis on which Canadians vote. But foreign affairs matter. I know this firsthand. At the start of the Second World War, a young Chinese boy was defended by Canadian soldiers in Hong Kong. Half of those Canadians died or were wounded. And at the end of that same war, a young Dutch girl was liberated by Canadian soldiers in the Netherlands. Over 7,000 of their comrades never came back home and died in the canals, the fields, and the villages of the Netherlands. That Dutch girl and that Chinese boy were my parents. They came to Canada after the war in search of a better life. They believed in Canada. They believed in our nation's ability, generation after generation, to look beyond a person's color or their creed, to harness their ambition, to build a better Canada. And that's true of the millions of Canadians who came to Canada over the past few decades or in the more distant past to make this country their home and native land, to build a better life for themselves and for their children, to build a better Canada. This is a nation whose founders, just over 150 years ago, came together to build a new country. They built a constitution and a democratic system that endure to this day, one of the world's 3 oldest continuous democracies. They built a constitution that enshrined timeless values and principles about democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. They made Canada free, prosperous, and united, and they overcame their divisions, deep divisions of language, religion, and ethnicity. The Canada they stood for is the Canada we must stand for, both here and abroad. And that is the Canada the government of Canada must stand for here and abroad. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to our discussion and the questions that you may have. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael. We're now going to move to the moderated question and answer part of the webinar. And many club members and other attendees have pre-submitted questions. If you would like to ask Michael a question, you can submit them through the question and answer function. And I see we've already got a few questions that have come through on that. So I'm actually going to start online with the questions. First question that was submitted. Hello, Michael. Hope you and your family are well. Can you give your opinion about the options for the Americans under Biden to drop the charges against Meng to pave the way for the return of the 2 Michaels, referring to Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor?
Well, thank you for the question. Mr. Spavor, Mr. Kovrig now have been in wrongful detention, wrongfully jailed now for over 2 years. And this is something that we all should be very concerned about. Our view is that the current government, the Liberal government, needs to work with the new Biden administration and needs to work closely with them to help win US support for the release of the two Michaels. China is a superpower, as is the United States, and with the assistance of allies like the United States, I believe that we can secure their release. I believe that one of the things we should also be doing with the incoming Biden administration is we should be working with them closely on our mutual interest and our mutual strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. That currently is not the case. The Liberal government is not working with our American allies in the Indo-Pacific region. A couple of examples. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the current government, the current Prime Minister snubbed the 10 heads of government at the APEC summit in November of 2017, I believe it was, and refused to show up because he was taking some meeting with, I believe it was with the social media companies. I believe it was with Facebook, rather than meeting with the 10 heads of government at that time. As a result, they were furious, and the entire Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement almost fell apart. The current government has poor relations with India, another important democratic ally in Indo-Pacific. They had a disastrous 8-day trip to India, which we all know about, that involved bringing along convicted terrorists, and that set back relations with India many, many years. And on the US strategy in the Indo-Pacific, they've also made mistakes. It was President Obama who asked the Canadian government not to join the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And what did the Liberal government do? They joined the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, directly at odds with US interests and policies in the Far East. So my view is that we should withdraw from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that we should ban Huawei from the core of our 5G network, that we should indicate to India, to Australia, to the United States, and to Japan that we wish to join their quadrilateral security dialogue as an effort to counter China's negative influences. And if we agree to do that, one of the things which helps US interests and tangentially Canadian interests in the Far East, that would also allow us then to say to the Biden administration, we need your help on securing the release of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. And that is a coherent, consistent foreign policy that works multilaterally with our allies, that serves both Canadian and American and other allied interests, and that also helps to defend the interests of securing the release of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor.
Excellent. We've actually got quite a few questions related to China. Next question is a fairly lengthy one that was pre-submitted. While I strongly support Canada banning the use of Huawei technology in our communication systems, it is very likely that they will retaliate by withdrawing the funding and financing they provide for numerous small Canadian tech startups. Much of this tech is leading edge, as Huawei targets the best, and it will be lost if the government does not step in to support these firms. Can you commit to finding a way to ensure these emerging tech companies survive the banning of Huawei equipment?
Well, thank you for the question. I believe that there has to be a whole government approach on this. It's not simply looking at Huawei's involvement with the build out of the core of our 5G network. It's also more broadly looking at university partnerships and some of the things you referenced in your question. And so, yes, I believe the government has to take a broader approach than just a simple decision on Huawei. But I finished by saying this. The decision should have been taken a long time ago. The lack of a decision is causing more problems than if the government had made a decision in favor of Huawei 2 years ago and putting that question to bed. Instead, they've dithered, and we now have policy confusion all over the place, coming from telecommunications companies who are unsure about what they can do. A year ago, TELUS announced that they were going to use Huawei in the build out of their 5G network. Then 6 months later, they did a 180 and announced they were abandoning that approach to use Huawei. Our allies are completely confused by our position. They don't know what our position is. and so many other things that have flowed from that lack of a decision. So the government needs to make a decision. They should have made one a long time ago. And when they do, they need to take into account the implications of that decision, such as university partnerships and such as the impact it might have on tech startups.
Okay, excellent. US President Joe Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline construction permit as one of his very first executive orders. And this one questioner is asking, do you believe that Canada should bring trade sanctions against the US in retaliation if negotiations are unable to reverse course?
Well, I think this decision to nix Keystone XL actually was not made. The mistake on that wasn't made this week. This mistake was made by the Trudeau government 5 years ago. The decision by the Biden administration to nix Keystone XL is simply a reaffirmation of a decision the Obama-Biden administration made in 2015. In November of 2015, Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet were appointed to government. And in the first phone call the Prime Minister received from the Obama-Biden administration of the day, it was communicated clearly that they were not approving Keystone XL. And so the decision to nix Keystone XL this week is simply a reaffirmation of a decision that was taken 5 years ago. And my view is that the Trudeau government made a mistake 5 years ago when it came to Keystone XL. They said in word that they were in favor of Keystone XL, but their actions said otherwise. And the proof is this, just one proof among many. The proof is that in that phone call, the Prime Minister, when told that President Obama was not going to approve Keystone XL, was also invited to a state dinner at the White House, a celebratory state dinner to celebrate and fet Justin Trudeau. The Prime Minister accepted. And when that state dinner took place several months later, it was a celebratory dinner. And there was much talk of bromance in the air. There were many smiles and chuckles all around. And there were very few words mentioned about Keystone XL. And so the Obama administration, the Obama-Biden administration, took away from that something very powerful. That while the Trudeau government said it was supportive of Keystone XL, they weren't really in support of it. And that state dinner proved to them that that was the case. And so it wasn't a surprise that the Biden administration just reaffirmed that decision of 5 years ago, because the Trudeau government had long telegraphed that while it said it was in support of Keystone XL, that its actions said very much the other way.
Excellent. Next question is online and is actually from the former Waterloo Member of Parliament, Peter Braid. Hi, Michael, great to see you. What would you suggest the government do to better respond to the ongoing concerns occurring in Hong Kong?
Well, thanks, Peter. Great to see you on the call. Great to hear from you on the call. And I'm delighted to be able to reconnect with you. I hope everything's well with you and everyone at home. Hong Kong is an important issue. Hong Kong is one of those issues that touches not only on our values, our belief in democracy, our belief in human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and the rule of law. It also touches on our interests. It's one of those areas in foreign policy where our interests and our values intersect. And what is our interest in Hong Kong? Well, first, Canadian soldiers died defending Hong Kong. Some 2,000 Canadians were sent over to Hong Kong to defend it in the Second World War. Half of them were casualties in that battle. The highest casualty rate of that war. In fact, it was the first land combat of the Canadian military in the Second World War. And not only did we suffer horrific casualties in the Battle of Hong Kong, with half being dead or wounded, the remaining survivors were taken prisoner of war and disappeared for some 3 years. Nobody knew where they were. Many of them died, and many of them never made it out of horrific conditions in the prisoner of war camp. So we have a very direct interest in Hong Kong, for that reason, but also for the reason that there are some 300,000 Canadian citizens living in Hong Kong. It's often called Canada's 10th largest province because there are more Canadians living in Hong Kong than there are people living in Prince Edward Island. So for that reason, what is going on in Hong Kong directly concerns us. And to be clear, China is violating an international treaty in what it has done in Hong Kong, in its imposition of a draconian national security law, and in its subsequent crackdown on the people of Hong Kong. That international treaty is the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration, a treaty that was registered at the United Nations, a treaty that guarantees Hong Kong for a period of 50 years beyond 1997, rights of assembly, rights of association, the accountability of the chief executive, Carrie Lam, back to the Legislative Council of Hong Kong, and much more. China has violated that, and our view is that the government should impose Magnitsky sanctions, working with their allies, on those officials in Hong Kong and in Beijing responsible for this violation of an international treaty. Thanks, Peter, for the question.
Excellent. Thanks, Peter. I should also mention we have other people on the line here. Walter McLean, Honorable Walter McLean, who served for many years as the MP for Waterloo, is on the line. And we have a question from Matt Bondi, who's nomination candidate in the neighboring riding of Kitchener-Conestoga. Mr. Chong, how can Canada work with our democratic allies to promote freedom and the rule of law against anti-democratic powers like China and Russia?
Well, that's a great question, and best wishes on your nomination challenge. My view is that there's a huge opportunity for the Liberal government that I hope they take advantage of. Canada is not a great power. We are some 37 million people in a planet of 7 billion people. And it's important that in order to defend our interests, that we work with allies collectively to defend those interests. The incoming president, the new administration, President Biden, during his election campaign, promised to create a coalition of democracies to counter the increasing threats coming from authoritarian regimes like China and Russia and Iran and many others. And to that end, I think that the Prime Minister in his phone call tomorrow with the American president should propose to help President Biden fulfill his campaign commitment. I think the current Prime Minister should propose to help him create this coalition of democracies, the D10, the Democratic 10, as some people are calling it, and should propose that Canada will help organize it, that will host it in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I think that would be an opportunity for us to work with the United States on a key foreign policy commitment, to bring together dozen or so, half a dozen other democratic allies, and to come up with a new coalition of democracies to counter these threats coming from authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. So I think that is the low-hanging fruit that Canada should pursue to defend its interests and to strengthen the rules-based multilateral system. Thanks for the question.
Great. Good. We have a question online. Immigration has been said to be a big priority to grow our GDP. How do you see foreign affairs policy influencing immigration?
Well, foreign policy is a projection of who we are, and we're in a race for global talent. So I think we should be using an integrated approach when it comes to attracting the best and brightest from around the world. And so to that end, I think that there's a number of things that we could do to do that. One of the things that Aaron O'Toole has promoted during his time as leader is the idea of CANZUG, the idea that we would create closer trade, investment, and other cooperation, including possibly labor mobility, between the four allies of Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. And so while it isn't immigration per se, it is an idea of greater labor mobility amongst these, that includes greater labor mobility amongst these four allies, that would help us address some of the labor shortages that we have, that would help us grow the economy and create prosperity for Canadians.
Great. Next question online. As a Black man who votes for your party, what is the Conservative Party doing to improve Black representatives in the Conservative caucus?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for your support. Well, we are constantly reaching out to cultural communities to seek their support and to encourage them to be involved. And we've made it clear in recent days that we will not tolerate anybody with racist or extremist views in our party. We've made it clear that white supremacy and white supremacists have no place in the Conservative Party Canada, that we are a moderate, mainstream, pragmatic party firmly placed in the center of Canadian politics, a party of confederation that has a proud tradition and history of welcoming people from all races, religions, and creeds. I'm very proud of the leadership of our party. I'm proud of Black leaders in our party, like Lincoln Alexander, the late Lincoln Alexander, who was the first elected member of Parliament from the Black community and the first member of the Black community to be a Canadian cabinet minister under the government of Joe Clark. So we've got a lot to be proud of, but there's more work to do. Parliament today does not reflect the diversity of this country. It is becoming increasingly diverse, but it's not as diverse as the country is today. And so I'm happy to reach out to you if you want to chat with me about what it takes to get involved in politics, what it takes to win a party nomination, what it takes to win in an election. Send me an email and I'd be happy to chat with you or any other member of the community that you think might be interested in doing that. So thank you very much for the question.
Excellent. You briefly mentioned this earlier, but the Liberals have shuffled through several foreign affairs ministers over the years and appointed another new foreign affairs minister, Marc Garneau, just last week. What would be your priority issue to raise with the new minister?
Well, I think the priority issue I'm looking from the new minister is to see whether he's going to pivot Canadian foreign policy yet again away from the foreign policy of Minister Champagne, the previous minister. And the reason why I think that's an important question to be answered is because the first minister, Minister Dion, in 2015, set Canada down a foreign policy path of what he termed constructive engagement. And so he embarked on that policy while he was a foreign affairs minister and tried to engage countries that Canada had normally not been engaged with. He was replaced by the PMO because they didn't agree with his policy of constructive engagement, with Chrystia Freeland, who instead proposed a policy of Canada being, quote, an essential country, and proposed that one of Canada's two foreign policy pillars be the economic recovery plan of the Liberal government, something that I touched on in my opening remarks. And we all know how that culminated in a disastrous failure to secure a UN Security Council seat. She was replaced with Minister Champagne, who had an incoherent and inconsistent policy on China. And so we now have a fourth minister, foreign minister, in a government that's only been in place for 5 years. And so what I'm looking for first and foremostly is to see whether or not there'll be continuity in Canadian foreign policy, or if it will revert back to the old pattern of having a different policy for a new minister, the fourth in 5 years.
Excellent. Now you've already touched on certain parts of this, but in general, how do you think new President Biden will change US-Canada relations?
Well, I think it's a dramatic change for Canada-US relations. You know, there is no more important foreign relation to Canada than the United States. Our bilateral trade relationship is almost $1 trillion a year in two-way trade between our two countries. That represents almost half of Canada's GDP, half of our economy. Our exports to the United States are about 20% of our economy. Almost 1 in 5 things we do in our country each and every day is for export to the United States. And being from Waterloo Region and being myself from Wellington County next door, I know that full well. With the Linamar plants that supply parts plants across the province that build vehicles largely destined for American export, with the Toyota plant in Cambridge, the Honda plant in Alliston, the Chrysler plant in Bramalea, the GM plant in Oshawa, and so many more plants scattered across the province. You know, it is an important relationship. I think Biden has clearly signaled in his inaugural speech that he wants to renew America's alliances. And so that's an opportunity for us to work more closely with the Americans on renewing multilateral institutions like the WHO and like the WTO. The United States announced just in the last 24 hours that they were rejoining the WHO. And I think that's a good thing. I hope and I believe that by working with the Americans, we can reform the WHO. The WHO has not performed its function during this pandemic. China has been a disruptive influence at the WHO that has been clearly documented in investigative reports by the New York Times and so many other investigative journalists. And so we should be working with the Biden administration on reform of the WHO in order to make sure that its pandemic surveillance is better than it was, and that China is held accountable for its refusal to cooperate with the WHO investigators in discovering the source of the virus in China. To this point, China has refused to allow investigators from the WHO to go to Wuhan to investigate the source of this virus. And if we can't investigate the source and determine the source of this virus, we are at big risk of repeating another pandemic like this. Because if we don't know where the source is, whether it's from bats, whether it's from wet markets, whether it's from civets, whether it's from from a non-animal, then we can't possibly take measures globally to reduce the risk of transmission from whatever source it was to humans. And so China has a lot to account for here, and its disruptive role in the WHO needs to be challenged, and the United States can play a leadership role, and Canada can support that. With WTO, the WTO has been effectively suspended for the last number of years. The reason being is that the United States under the Trump administration had refused to appoint judges to the appellate court, the Court of Appeal. And so many trade disputes were going unregulated, unanswered, because there was no Court of Appeal to sit, because the Americans refused to appoint judges. So my hope is that that mechanism gets restarted so that trade disputes that Canada has can be adjudicated largely in our favor, because we are a fair trading partner. We also need to reform the WHO, though, in order to ensure that it's serving its function. And so the Ottawa Working Group that the current government has set up, I think, is a good starting point to work with the Biden administration to strengthen the multilateral system and these alliances. So those are just some ideas of how the relationship between Canada and the United States I hope will change under the Biden administration, and the opportunities that the Canadian government has to strengthen our interests and defend our values.
Excellent. We have a sort of a fun question here. Do you think we should look to having a Caribbean nation join Canada as a province, where we can extend our trade, infrastructure, universities, hospital networks, and establish long-term care centers there to provide a win-win-win for both sets of people? And there's suggesting Turks and Caicos. I think there was some talk about this a few years ago.
Yeah. Well, Turks and Caicos, I know, has been an issue that has been brewing for a number of years now. I believe my former colleague, Peter Goldring, promoted it for a number of years. My view is that that should not be our priority in foreign policy, simply because we are not big enough to have too many priorities. I think a government needs to pick 2, maybe 3 foreign policy priorities and focus what limited resources we have as a federal government in putting into effect those foreign policy priorities. And so while I think the idea of having a country like Turks and Caicos join the Canadian Confederation is an interesting one, the unfortunate reality is we simply don't have the resources to focus on that at this present time. But thank you very much for the question, especially during these winter months.
It would be nice. Okay, Conservative MP Derek Sloan was recently removed from the CPC caucus under the Reform Act process. And I know several years ago, you were the author of the Reform Act when it became legislation. Could you outline the difference in the process that the party went through earlier this week compared to the process that existed before the Reform Act was passed?
Well, thank you for the question. And it allows me an opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is parliamentary reform and our constitutional structures. what happened before, there's two things I can say about what happened before the Reform Act was put into place in our caucus and in other caucuses. First, the process was ad hoc and arbitrary. In some cases, the leader made a decision to kick out somebody from caucus after an investigation had been concluded. In other cases, the leader simply decided to kick somebody out without any due process or procedural fairness. Some people were kicked out for serious offenses. Others were kicked out for rumors and for no reason other than those rumors. And so before the rules for the Reform Act came into place, it was a very ad hoc and arbitrary process. In some cases, regional caucuses had a show of hands to decide if somebody should be kicked out of caucus, and that decision was simply followed by the leader, who then booted somebody from caucus. So it varied. It was situational. It depended on the situation, and it depended on the person. And so I didn't think that was fair. I think procedural fairness is the rule of law, ensuring that the rules are equitably applied to everybody, regardless of rank or station in life, I think is a fundamental tenet of a free and democratic society. And so that's why I pushed for the Reform Act. And so in the Conservative caucus, the Reform Act rule on the expulsion of a member is now in place. And so that rule is quite simple, and it allows for procedural fairness. The rule says that for any member of the House of Commons caucus to be expelled, two things have to happen. First, at least 20% of the caucus have to request a review vote of a particular member. If fewer than 20% of the caucus request a review vote, no review vote will take place. If 20% or more do request a review vote, then the caucus chair must call a meeting to review the member and to have the review vote. That vote must be a secret ballot vote, and that vote must be passed not by a majority of members present for the vote, but it sets a high bar for expulsion. It must be passed by a majority of members in the entire caucus, even if they're not present. So in other words, if there are 120 members in caucus and only 80 members show up for a vote, the threshold to expel a member is not 41 members, it's 61 members, reflecting 50% plus one of the caucus of 120. So you can't vote to expel by not showing up. You have to show up for the vote. And so that's the two-step process to expel a member. Before a member is expelled, there's a debate that takes place. Members in favor of expulsion and against are able to say their piece. And obviously the member that is the subject of the review is also able to open and to finish and to present their case. And so it's a very fair, transparent process that puts in place procedural fairness and ensure that things are more orderly when it comes to the membership of a member. That's very unlike what the Liberal caucus has done in recent years. The Liberal caucus has not implemented the Reform Act rules. And we all know what happened to ministers Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould. The Prime Minister unilaterally booted them from caucus, even though they had stood on principle, simply because he wanted to get rid of them. And I don't think that kind of thing should be allowed to stand in a free and democratic society. And I think it's an affront to our constitutional order. I don't think any party leader should have that power.
Excellent. Can you comment on today's resignation of the Governor General?
Yes, I can. First of all, it's very concerning. And I think it reflects a broader pattern of appointments on part of this current government. Let's not forget the range of appointments they have made that have been failures. They proposed that Michael Chong seek a second term on La Francophonie, and that campaign ended in tatters and was an international embarrassment for Canada. And eventually she withdrew her candidacy, and the Canadian government was embarrassed by the whole situation. Let's also not forget that they politicized the Commissioner of Official Languages. Through Liberal and Conservative governments for over 40 years, the Commissioner of Official Languages was a non-partisan appointment. And at the beginning of the Liberal government's time in office, when Graham Fraser retired as a very good official languages commissioner, they proposed a Liberal MPP from Ottawa, Madeleine Mayer, as the new Commissioner of Official Languages, causing a huge outcry from official language minority groups across the country. They subsequently withdrew that proposed nomination because it was such a terrible one. And with the Governor General itself, they made a huge mistake. And the first mistake they made is that the Prime Minister disbanded the committee of experts that had been assembled by former Prime Minister Harper to come up with a short list and advise the Prime Minister on appointments to vice-regal offices in Canada, not just the Governor General's office, but also the offices of the Lieutenant Governors across this country. And it led to very good appointments, such as the Lieutenant Governor Philman in Manitoba, such as Lieutenant Governor Elizabeth Dowdeswell in Ontario, and such as Governor General David Johnston at the federal level. But the current government abandoned that process in favor of picking their own insiders, and that resulted in the just resigned Governor General that took place today. So I think that the current government needs to reconstitute the Committee of Experts quickly to ensure that they just don't appoint another Ottawa insider and instead look far and abroad for the most qualified candidates so that the committee can present a shortlist to the Prime Minister, and from that shortlist, a qualified Governor General can be appointed. And the final thing I'll say on this is this: the Governor General plays an important constitutional role, particularly in a minority parliament. And so today's resignation is very concerning in light of that.
Excellent. A question has come in online. How will the Conservative Party plan to build the Canadian military to a level that can defend our nation on the world stage, especially the North, considering what is transpiring in this area?
Well, that's a great question. I think the key to building a stronger Canadian military is a stronger Canadian economy. And the reason why I say this is this: we cannot build a stronger foreign policy and a stronger military without a robust, growing Canadian economy. The reality is, the harsh reality is, if we are honest with ourselves, is that Canada's place in the world has declined, and declined significantly. Now, it's not all because of actions taken by the Canadian government. It's in part because of the rise of the rest. You know, if you think about the dominance of the West in our multilateral system, countries like Canada, the United States, the UK, Europe, that has been the reality of the post-war structure in organizations like the United Nations, the UN Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF, and so many other multilateral organizations. The West was dominant for many, many decades. In more recent years, we've seen the rise of the rest, countries like China, India, the ASEAN countries, and Japan, and so many more. So our decline on the world stage is not simply a result of actions taken by the Canadian government. It's in part because of the rise of the rest. However, we have contributed to Canada's decline in recent years, Canadian governments, that is. Our commitments are not being met. We haven't met our ODA commitment ever, not even come close. Canada's ODA commitment, set out by Lester Pearson when he was heading up a World Bank committee, has been 0.7% of GDP. We've never come close to meeting that commitment. The closest we ever came was under the government of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney in the 1980s, when I think our commitment rose to about 0.4, 0.5% of GNI. But we've never come close. And when it comes to climate change, Canada hasn't met a single climate change commitment ever. And on both those two counts, on climate change and on foreign aid, many countries have met those commitments. In fact, many countries have exceeded those commitments. And that's why some of these smaller countries like Norway and like Ireland actually win Security Council seats because they meet or exceed their commitments. Now, to answer your question, on Canada's military, we haven't met our NATO commitments in decades. In fact, we only spend about half of our NATO commitment, just over 1% of GDP. So my conclusion has been, looking at history, is that the only way we're ever going to meet our NATO commitment of spending 2% of our economic output on national defense and security is if we significantly grow our economy in order to produce the growing and swelling revenues that will allow governments to increase defense spending. And so I think that is the only way forward. And until we get that part of the equation right, the part of the equation that concerns a growing economy, I think it will be very difficult for Canadian governments to come close to meeting our 2% commitment. Thank you for the question.
Excellent. Just time for one last question. And this is actually a question that I asked of all four leadership candidates this past summer when they appeared on Confederation Club webinars. As recently as the 2008 and 2011 federal elections, the Conservative Party swept all Waterloo Region seats. However, in the 2019 federal election, it was the Liberal Party that swept every riding in Waterloo Region. What does the Conservative Party have to do to reverse this dreadful trend in Waterloo Region?
Well, I think we need to appeal to more Canadians. The reality is that we need 1 million more votes. And those are the votes that reside in regions like Waterloo. The reality is that unless we grow our party and we appeal to many more groups of people, we will not win the election. And so that's why Aaron O'Toole has made it clear that his goal is to grow the party and to build a much bigger tent to attract Canadians from all walks of life. And so my view is that we've got to work hard to attract candidates to run for our party in the Waterloo Region ridings. And along with that, we have to come forward with policies to help the economic recovery. In the immediate term, our concern is with the pandemic. The Liberal government's poor record on securing vaccinations is becoming ever more clear. To date, only 1.6% of Canadians have been vaccinated. In the United States, almost more than double that amount have been vaccinated to date, and almost triple that amount have been vaccinated on a per capita basis. They are approaching 4% vaccination of their country. And there are people that speculate that by the end of this quarter, early in the second quarter, the United States will have inoculated almost 1/3 of their population. The Liberal government's goal for Canada is only 8% at best. And with the announcement recently that Pfizer was not shipping the vaccine, is delaying the shipment of vaccines to Canada, we will struggle to achieve even 8%. Israel has vaccinated 1/4 of their population already. The United Kingdom has vaccinated, I think, over 6% of their population already. I repeat this number. We are at 1.6%, and we will be receiving no vaccinations next week. The Prime Minister has yet to make a phone call to the CEO of Pfizer in order to secure these vaccines. So my view is, in order to win more seats in the Waterloo Region, we need to focus on the concerns of Canadians, which is, what are we doing as a party? What are we proposing as a party to help with the immediate threat of the pandemic and to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible? The next question, once we emerge out of the pandemic, is what policies are we proposing to recover from the devastating economic fallout of the pandemic? And I believe that our party is best positioned to answer those two questions as we head into the next election. So thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for allowing me to talk to you today.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael, once again for providing your keen insight into many important issues of our time. I'll now turn things over to Barb to formally thank you for speaking today.
Thank you, Steve. And on behalf of the Confederation Club, I would like to thank Mr. Chong for taking the time to speak to us this evening and to contribute to bringing Canadian digital politics to life. Folks, it looks like we're going to be virtual for a few more months, so we invite you to visit confederationclub.ca and sign up so that we can send you emails on the exciting new speakers that we're planning on inviting in the coming months. And we encourage you to share this information with your friends and your family. And we look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Michael.
Bye.
Thank you.